Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Wait for just a few more people to get on and we'll get started. Allison, you got the kickoff?
Yeah, just let me know when y'all are ready.
Let's see, I see one more person joining as soon as they're here. Well, seems like it's taking them a bit. Maybe we should just go ahead and get started.
All right. Welcome everybody. We've got two important UDO advisory committee meetings this month with some meaty topics for you all to discuss today and next week, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. I'm actually going to give the presentation today, which I was talking to Monica earlier. I was like, I'm not sure I've actually done the presentation for UAC before. So I don't know if that tells you about the importance of the issue, but I'm bringing the conversation forward today. Laura, Alan, is there any other intro things that we need to go over? Or can I just launch right into it?
Launch in.
So I will share my screen. All right, are we good? Can someone let me know?
Yep.
All right, perfect. So what I want to start with is I just want to talk again about the purpose as to why you all are here. You are an important part of the conversations around implementing the comp plan and making refinements to the UDO. And so we've organized a group of people that come from neighborhood perspectives, environmental groups, they're designers, they're development professionals. And what you're here to do is to provide early feedback on potential UDO changes before we engage the broader community, the Planning Commission and City Council. So this has never been intended to replace any of those things. That what we really value is an opportunity to sort of test some early ideas and get some initial feedback before we start going more broadly into the community. And so I wanted to mention that we've got a couple of our planning commissioners online as well. They're here to listen to the conversation because ultimately when we start to move forward with something that's more formal, we will go before the zoning committee of the Planning Commission, who actually provides ultimately a recommendation to City Council. So important to have them involved early in the conversation. And I wanted to have a few commissioners listen to the feedback that we get from you all. So what we're going to talk about here in February, and so this is a couple different things. It's a check-in on where we are with UDO and where we are with the Charlotte 2040 comprehensive plan implementation. And the two topics that we're going to discuss this week and next week are around our residential developments and infill development. So today, what we're really going to focus on is we had a referral from City Council. So what that means is that Council directs staff to consider something very specific, which will read you the exact referral. But then the other reason too is that we're about 7-8 months into the UDO going into effect and starting to take a look at what we've seen, what projects we're getting in, and are we getting the outcomes that we aspire to in the comprehensive plan. Next week, what we're going to do is we are going to talk more specifically about individual lots, so duplexes and triplexes on individual lots, so infill development. Today is really more about those larger development sites. And so On May 22nd, we were at a city council meeting. There was a zoning case that came before city council that was proposing a number of townhomes, and in the conversation, in the consideration of the rezoning petition, council began to understand that there were by right options for triplexes and duplexes that were of a density that they were questioning. And so what they asked staff to do was to recommend alternative options, including a schedule for potential changes to the UDO for allowing duplexes and triplexes in large projects developing by right in residential zoning. So that's the exact verbiage of the referral, which is part of why we're here today. The other part is, we've been getting some plans in, and what we've started doing as a planning department is we're sitting down with the comprehensive plan team, the UDO team, and our permitting team. And so I think all those sort of division managers and people that are involved, from Alicia Osborne and Laura Harmon and Dave Pettin and Shannon Fry, and others, like sitting down and taking a look at site plans and looking at are we getting what we wanted? Is the density appropriate? Is the open space appropriate? Is the layout and the access appropriate? And we've had some things that we've seen that we would like to consider changes. And so I mentioned the comp plan a couple times. The UDO, of course, is a very important implementation tool for the vision that's set forth in the Charlotte 2040 comprehensive plan. And so when we're evaluating potential changes, we always want to look back towards our compass and our goals and our vision in the comprehensive plan, because that's really the focus of what the UDO is intended to do, is to implement that. So let's start with what our goal is. And so in the Charlotte Future 2040 comprehensive plan, goal number 2 is that Charlotte will strive to have a diversity of housing options by increasing the presence of middle density housing, or missing middle housing. There's lots of different names for that, which means duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, townhomes, ADUs, and other small housing types, and ensuring land use regulations allow for flexibility in the creation of housing within neighborhoods. So I like to use this slide. I think Opticos did a great job of putting this together, because when we talk about missing middle housing, I think this really helps to clarify what we're talking about. And for decades now, we have really built on opposite extremes of the housing spectrum. We've built lots of single family houses, and we've built a lot of apartments, and we've underbuilt for decades all the things that are in between. And I think it's really important to recognize that, because we all don't want to live in a single family home, or we all don't want to live in an apartment, or we can't, or we need other options. And so we need different housing opportunities and options in Charlotte. And this is not unlike many other cities in the United States that are really talking about how to increase our housing opportunities. So, so what we started doing is, as I mentioned, we're reviewing what we're seeing, but then we're also listening and want to kind of highlight some of the things that we've been hearing recently as the UDO has gone into effect. So how do we intend to apply goal number 2 on large developments? The way it's written is really focused on that missing middle housing. But how did that apply for large developments? Did we want complete neighborhoods of only duplexes or triplexes? Questions about whether the buffers are sufficient. Are we preserving enough tree canopy? Are we considering sensitive areas and environmentally appropriate locations? Sometimes the buildings are larger than the adjacencies. How do we reach our affordability goals? And how do we increase our home ownership opportunities? So we also started looking at the research and what are we seeing? What kind of trends are we seeing by development type? And so kind of I'll go through each row. The first row being single family detached. So these are the single family homes of that we've had around for quite some time. And you can really see that over time, we've had a significant decrease in the number of single family homes that have been built. Meanwhile, the next line, the single family attached and the townhomes have really seen a drastic increase in the number, a number of those. And you'll see that too in the number of closings. It's just become, townhomes have become a product type that is naturally more affordable. And so we've seen a big increase in the number of townhomes that have been constructed over single family. Duplexes to quadplexes, we haven't really seen a lot. I think that 2023 number is not, may not capture the entire year when we got this data. So that number is probably a little higher, but again, we're underbuilding in that category. And then of course, as we all have seen very clearly, particularly in South End, we've seen a ton of apartments being built. And so particularly in the last couple of years, we've seen a lot that has been constructed here in Charlotte. So when we went to the City Council Committee, the Transportation Planning and Development Committee, which is a committee of the full City Council, we presented some of these similar findings, and the recommendation that we made to the Council Committee on February 5th was to refer the conversation to the UDO Advisory Committee to explore and provide recommendations on the following. So first is in a bucket of quantity, consider requiring a mix of building types in any development over 5 acres with duplexes and triplexes. We had a lot of robust discussion about whether a large site was 5 acres or should it be something less. And I think they really landed that it needed to be something less. We also talked about the quality of the developments, consider modifications to the development standards to increase open space and other standards that implement the goals of the comp plan and that relate to walkability and livability. And then thirdly is about location. Are there places in the community that are very much appropriate for large developments of duplexes and triplexes, or are there areas that we want to consider not being the target areas for growth? And so the conversation I had with City Council was that, again, you are a group of individuals that were selected to be part of the advisory committee to really help us dive into some of these details, and very much looking forward to the conversations that we will have today. So, as I mentioned before, we always want to go back to the comp plan. So we've talked about one of the goals that involves neighborhood diversity inclusion, but as we start to talk about what we might want to consider changing, we kind of did an inventory of some of our policies, and I wanted to bring forward some of these just so that you're thinking about that as we start to talk about things that we might consider changing. So policy 1.3 in the 10-minute neighborhoods is implement complete neighborhood policies that encourage mixes of different types of uses depending on the development's context. 2.9 in the development regulations require larger developments to include a mix of housing types. Policy 9.33, develop a program to encourage the development of infill, small-scale, single-family, and duplex residents that meet the city's desired form requirements. I'll tell you that this is probably more related to the conversation next week, but we are working on a pattern book of duplexes and triplexes and quads that are pre-approved that people can use that I think will provide some compatibility with existing neighborhoods and also make it less expensive to develop. And policy 10.17, evaluate development regulations to ensure they encourage infill and redevelopment and adjust regulations to remove barriers or create incentives as needed. It's delayed here for a second. There we go. And then we also looked at our place type manual and implementation strategy. So wanting to use the place type manual to guide transitions within neighborhoods to more intense use types that can accommodate affordable and workforce housing. And the place type manual, neighborhood 1, the goal is to provide places for neighborhoods with a variety of housing types where single family housing is still the predominant use. And then there's some discussion about neighborhood character overlays as a tool to reduce or mitigate changes to community character while balancing the needs to diversify the housing stock. And so I think we've talked a lot to the community and council about these overlay districts. And I think kind of one thing that's missing here is that's a very formal tool to talk about community character, and that there may need to be some other discussions about things that are less formal. Okay, so there's 4 areas that we're going to talk about today. And what I'm planning on doing is I'm going to go through the entire presentation and all together, so you see kind of the big picture. And then we'll come back and we'll pause for discussion on each of these 4 areas. And so the first is considering a requirement for mixing housing types, just to ensure that balance that we were talking about that relates to the comp plan policy. The second bucket is revising the conservation development standards to yield outcomes that are aligned to the Charlotte Future 2040 plan. Conservation development is a type of development where you're subdividing the lots and allowing for smaller parcels in exchange for higher amounts of open space. And so I think there's some right sizing that we need to do there. The third bucket, prioritizing concentrating density and housing next to our centers where we're really working to implement the 10-minute neighborhood, as well as in our transportation priority corridors. And then lastly, are there areas of the community that should not be prioritized for additional density or for growth opportunities? Okay, so the first one, what we are seeing. So this is a site plan or sketch plan that we've received after the UDO went into effect. And although these look like townhomes, they're actually triplexes. So they're side-by-side units, although they can, in some ways, they're like a 3-unit townhome project. We're seeing a lot of submittals that are only duplexes and triplexes with a pretty high level of intensity. And so the question that we've been asking and the council has asked us is that do subdivisions of only duplexes or triplexes meet the goals of the 2040 plan? So the first thing that we wanted to bring forward for consideration is prioritizing housing diversity. And so the idea is that we're bringing to you all is on development sites 2 acres or larger in our N1 or neighborhood 1 zoning districts, require sites to either include a housing mix or they have a density limit. And so the idea is that if there's a housing mix required, that there's a minimum amount of single family and duplexes that have to be provided, and there's a max number of triplexes that can be on the development site. We recognize that there are some developers and projects that really don't work in multiple housing product types. And so there is another option that we're throwing here out on the table here, is that there's just a density cap so that there's certainty and understanding as to the intensity of development that can be on that particular site. And so this would be something that, yeah. John, do you have a quick question?
I do. How large in acres is the project you just showed us?
That is a great question.
Because it would give us all a visual as to what we're talking about.
Yeah, sure. Monica, or can you find that out and drop that? Are she still on?
Perfect.
Yeah, I'm on. I'm here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll let you know. The one that showed the different types in it.
The one back up right
Oh,
there.
this one. Okay, I'll find it.
And also earlier you showed this image and then one that shows all the green. That's a linear project. What are the 2 sizes of both of those would be very helpful to me.
Yeah, that's a great question. And then Monica, also the one that's next to would be the one in Plaza.
That you're going to show us. Okay, great.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you.
So the idea with this concept, as I was mentioning, that it's recognizing that there are some developers that only build in one product type, but we've hired a consultant to do some site planning sketch work for us. And the idea here is that in plain language, we would be rewarding in terms of intensity projects that have a mix of housing types, but still providing that certainty of a density cap to allow projects to proceed. So, and this is what I was referring to, John. So there's a site here in Plaza Midwood that I think is a good example of how something like this would play out, because what I wanted to make it clear to council and to the community is that when we start talking about mixing housing types in a development site that, you know, is of a certain size, you're not going to have a duplex and then a single family home and then a triplex. You're really, like, the way these projects are developed and the way they're constructed and the way that they're financed, you'd really create pods of development types, which, you know, I think is fine and appropriate. And I think that's how a lot of these projects are developed. But I just want to make it clear that that's the development pattern that would result in requiring a mix of housing types. Second bucket is talking about development standards. And so I've got an image over here on the right where you've got an existing subdivision next to a proposed subdivision that's adjacent to it. And so are there modifications to the development standards that better reflect the goals as outlined in the comp plan? So are we getting open space, high quality open space that is in line with the density and the intensity of the development? How do we feel about the amount of alleys, as an example, that's in this project? Alleys can be challenging. They're great and they're challenging. They're great for putting, you know, the building forward and having a pedestrian environment, but there's also some challenges there too in terms of servicing the units from a solid waste or who's maintaining the road. So there's some things to consider there that you need that need to be further evaluated. And then are we creating the right transitions and adjacencies between development projects? Do we need a greater separation with the new development with the side setbacks that are small, which we think are appropriate in creating more open space and concentrating the units in the development space? But does there need to be a greater transition when you're proposing something new within or next to an existing neighborhood? So the second thing that we're asking you to consider is updating the open space requirements to ensure we're meeting the original intent of the conservation development. Do some additional work to clarify where public streets should be required versus where alleys would be allowed, and create a larger transition, whether that's height or distance between conservation developments and properties that are mapped with an N1 place type. All right, the third is the locational criteria. And so based on activity centers, transportation corridors, and strategic investment areas, where should we be prioritizing density and large subdivisions? So a couple things I want to point out on this map that's to the right. So everything in red is a zoning parcel that is greater than 2 acres, that is zoned N1, A, B, and C. The area in purple, those are our community and regional activity center place types. And then in orange are our neighborhood place types. And so as you mentioned, as I've mentioned before, like, we're really starting to look at somewhere between 2 and 5 acres in terms of how we might want to consider potential changes to the development patterns. I wanted to mention too, because some of you may be aware and some others are not, that very recently City Council has proposed the idea of these strategic investment areas where there's targeted investment in infrastructure bundles, is really what they're calling. So it's not just a singular project in an area, it's a bundle of projects that work together that are more impactful when they work together. And these strategic investment areas of infrastructure investment are in a lot of places, they're really focused on our centers and focused on our corridors. And so I think that's also important that when we're talking about where we should be prioritizing density, I think it's also important to recognize that the centers are also the places where we're really talking about some focused city investment. So number 3, this is the third bucket. So this is similar to the first one, but this is really taking a step to focus our development activity around centers. And so Again, on subdivision sites, 2+ acres and are in one zoning districts, if you are within 1 mile of a regional activity center and 1 mile of a community activity center and a half a mile of a neighborhood center, then there's still the same option. You could require sites to include a housing mix or have a density limit. But the difference with this would be that when you're adjacent to a center, the housing mix requirement would have a maximum of single family. There would be no minimum or maximum for duplexes. I think that's a really, it's a great development project to bring light density into neighborhoods. We would have a higher maximum allowance for triplexes, and then we would introduce an allowance for townhomes. I have a lot of strong feelings about townhomes. As I mentioned, that's a product type that's been developed more recently, and it is a great opportunity for home ownership. And I think that we have underallocated in the community for townhomes. And so this is an opportunity to introduce this. And then there would again be a maximum density cap, and this max density cap would be larger than what we would have if you weren't adjacent to a center. So I just wanted to bring that forward. So I wanted just a quick example, just so I can, because we've talked about these either or things in the housing mix. So I just want to use an example, and I'm throwing out percentages that are not what I'm asking you to propose or to consider. So don't look at the DUA or the density maximums, and don't look at the percentages. This is just for the purposes of conversation. So just generally, if we were to require this housing mix, you could build, let's say, 5 dwelling units per acre, or 30 units if you're on a 6-acre site. And then we might do something where we require a minimum of 25% to be single family, a maximum of 25% triplexes, and the remainder could be duplexes, or you're just building 30 units of any unit type. Once you get into those locations that are within a mile of a community center, then you've got a maximum of 25% single family. We wouldn't require any minimum or maximum for duplexes. And then we start to increase the maximum for triplexes and then introduce the townhomes quads. So just wanted to put a plug in for the townhomes. As I mentioned, I have a lot of thoughts about those, but as you can see here, this is some work that we have a consultant doing for us right now. And while I'm not going to say that a sales price of $418,000 is affordable, it is certainly less affordable. It's certainly more affordable than a single family home where you've got an average sales price of $554,000. And so I really think, just as in general, we need to really start to think about how we can improve our opportunities for home ownership. And I think home ownership opportunities are not found in our apartments, and I think it's really challenging to find them in a single family detached product. And so it's really about other housing products. The last bucket is to right size development potential in areas not targeted for growth. So the figure over on the right is residential new construction in 2023. And when you look at that map, you can see that there's a large amount of development that's really concentrated sort of in this sort of diagonal sort of place here, which relates to the blue line, the transit corridor, which is great. I'm sure that's all the many apartments that we saw in that original number. But you're also seeing a lot of development here on the periphery of the city. And we've gotten the tree canopy results recently that really start to talk about how important the ETJ is for tree canopy preservation. So you can see that within the city, our tree canopy percentage is 47%, but in the ETJ it's 63%. So what we're considering is to limit density in the ETJ for subdivisions that are greater than 2 acres. And then on a similar sort of thought process, also really don't want to concentrate development in our floodplain. So eliminate all duplexes and triplexes within the floodplain, as well as within the airport noise disclosure overlay. Okay, so that was a lot. What my plan is to go back through and go through each of those 4 considerations for the committee. Unless someone wants to talk about something that's kind of broader than that, then I can open the floor up. But otherwise, I'm going to go back to this one. And I am not managing the chat, so if someone can help me with that too. All right, Patricia, I think I see your hand up. Patricia, if you're talking, we can't hear you. All right, I'm gonna go to John and then, if you, for some reason we can't hear you, maybe if you could try to put something in the chat for us.
Okay, Allison, I'll start while we're waiting for Patricia.
Okay.
Wow, this is a lot to go through. So I read your email the other day and went through that and tried to figure out where this is coming from. I presume that how this fits into existing neighborhoods is causing angst. Is that correct?
I think it's, I mean, it's, I think there's some angst with how things are fitting in with the existing neighborhoods. I think that, there's a level of intensity and density that I think maybe caught some people by surprise. I mean, you take a 6-acre site and you normally could do 3 dwelling units per unit, but, or per acre.
Right.
But now that duplexes and triplexes are allowed everywhere, you could, in essence, multiply that by 3. And so as sites get larger and larger, that multiplier effect gets larger and larger. And so, I think it's that, there's the development standards are probably one of the most important things that we'll be addressing pretty quickly. I think will kind of help with some of the conversation, but yes.
Okay, yeah, and I think hopefully we'll be involved in those development standards because I think that's where some of this can also be tweaked and make better. Wow, this goes way back because I know that I think I remember we were very reluctant to have percentages for these uses, and yet now that we're seeing what's landing, I understand why you're going here. I think the people who build these probably are going to have to weigh in on whether it's minimums and maximums or just maximum density. And you said there's a pattern book forthcoming, so that could deal maybe with the angst around what stuff, how it fits in.
The pattern book is really probably more so for your infill type of development, and the idea really that the idea really for the pattern book is to accelerate the production of infill development that's in scale of the existing neighborhoods, because we'd be able to sort of right size the product based on like the lot widths and standards of that neighborhood. So that's really, it's not, I mean, I'm sure it can be used for a larger development, but that's not the original purpose.
Okay. Well, yeah, probably the only comment I would make, because I did not do this for a living, so I don't know these how these things balance out, that the missing middle diagram that you showed us that really showed single family transitioning into all sorts of different types of missing middle and then getting to the typical 4, 5, 6-story apartment buildings is a very nice diagram of what we'd like to see. But when you have 9 acres of all triplex, you're not getting that unless the next 9 acres is something else and the previous 9 acres is yet a different level of density. So I think you're in the right direction. I don't think I can weigh in on any of these numbers. I'd have to see diagrams of what it means. And maybe someone could take one of these diagrams that you already have that's been proposed and show what that would mean to give everyone a visual sense of what the result is.
Yeah, we have someone working on that, but not wanting to go too far with the idea until we kind of test out some concepts
Sure. And I'll stop talking.
No,
Thanks.
you're good. Thanks, John.
Thank you.
I think I've got Eric next.
Yeah,
And
is
Alice?
Patricia?
Yeah, Laura, go ahead.
Yeah. I just say, Patricia has something in the chat, Allison. That's the only thing we have that hasn't already been answered.
Okay.
Yeah. You could get Patricia first, then I could go
Okay.
next.
She said, this is off topic somewhat, however, with the push for townhomes, my concern is accessibility for those with disabilities that is still being overlooked. No, that's a great point, and it's something that is really important for our consideration. I appreciate you bringing that forward, and I've got a lot of folks that are really helping out with the details of construction and standards on the call. And so we'll make sure that we're keeping that in consideration. So thank you. Eric.
Okay. Well, there's a lot here, so I'll try to get as many of my questions as possible. But I really like the mixture of housing. My first question is, would there be no more single family only duplexes? If we're adding mixes to everything, would we also be limiting that?
So I think that's why the other, there's a unit mix requirement or there's a density cap, and you could choose one or the other. And so you could still develop all single family or through that, or all duplexes or all triplexes, frankly. But the thing about that is that you know what the density is, like, you know how many units you can get. You can choose whatever kind of units those are. And I think that, I mean, you know, I'm not a developer, and I've got developers here, they're on the call that can weigh in on this, but my understanding is that there are people out there that are developing sites that only work in one product type. And so recognizing that they may not be able to develop all of those different types, but what I think is important is having some predictability in what the outcome is. And so that way, like, you know that the density on that site won't exceed X number, and you can do single family or you can do triplexes, but you know what the density is.
Okay, so you're just to be clear too, these or there's no and, I guess there's or. So proposing having both of these options in the revision, the text amendment?
Yes.
Or one or the other. What? Yeah.
Yeah. So the developer or the designer could choose either one.
Okay. So
And
both would be open to them.
We're trying to right-size it so that there's a unit count reward for choosing a mix of housing, but there's still an opportunity to proceed.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, I'm not a big fan of density and going back to density per acre that we left in the last zoning code, more form-based. But the one thing that John was mentioning and the missing middle from single family into the higher density, that's basically, you studied new urbanism, that's a transect. And I think that is, and we talked about, I mentioned this a long time ago in the draft, but would be useful, maybe tool to be able to figure out where your density should be the most as you go further out, like in the ETG areas, and then as you move closer to your centers. And I really do appreciate not this slide, but the other slide where you're talking about a mile, a half mile, and increasing your density and mixtures as you go. I know the percentages you said aren't necessarily the final percentages, but I think that makes sense. That's basically kind of smart growth and no growth barriers, though I know we can't really do no growth. It's like either limited growth to increasing your density. But yeah, I wish we could do something where we can figure out a way to limit those. The thing I'm afraid of is if we the way we write this, and we have this, the tree canopy in these green fields that are 60%, as you mentioned, in these undeveloped areas, and then we're still developing them in a sprawling way, right? And just increasing sprawl. So just keeping in mind of minimizing sprawl in these areas where we really need to preserve our tree canopy, right? And maximizing our growth in the areas that have the infrastructure and that are nearer centers. So that's kind of summarizing any of that has to be built into this text amendment.
Yeah, and I've thought about that a lot. And my thought process was that if you have a higher allowance for density there, it actually attracts people to create dense products there. And I'd rather attract the dense product adjacent to transportation corridors and centers where you're wanting to prioritize growth. And so you're never going to be able to like just put a moratorium out there. But I think if it's not achieving a certain yield, then it's less desirable. So, but I mean, I don't know how else to do that, but that's kind of where I landed.
Okay. And the only other thing I had was if you could maybe, for folks on the call familiar, like, I know you get a great overview of the slides, but just how the process works. So we have an issue of smaller lots that we'll talk about next week, right? But these bigger lots, there was an issue, I think, wasn't there by right where there wasn't a subdivision being invoking Article 30 with the subdivision, right? Is that still a concern if we're talking about a parcel that is not subdivided, but is putting multiplexes on it versus going through the subdivision ordinance? And then what that process has and what staff, because I believe staff still has the planning department has some say or a say in how that actual subdivision gets crafted, right? Before, so it's not it's by right, but by right with working with this planning department, right, with the subdivision article, correct? Just for some of the folks that might be familiar with that.
Sure, I'm following you. Monica or Laura, can y'all, either of you help me?
I'm not sure if I am. Are you? Okay,
I
so
think I followed it, Monica, if you want me to
okay,
jump
good,
in.
you go.
Eric, there are standards in the ordinance. So staff reviews to make sure that they are meeting the standards in the ordinance, but there's not anything discretionary. There may be suggestions, but
Okay.
staff doesn't have discretion, and it's a little bit different in some other jurisdictions.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure there, if somebody was doing a lot or a small, well, something that wasn't being subdivided, right, for ownership, that it would met like a single lot versus these larger developments that would actually go through a subdivision ordinance that require additional pieces compared to what if somebody was developing a duplex on a single lot, right? So just for clarity that there is
additional set of subdivision regulations that they'd have to go through. You're right. Yes.
Right. Okay. And as far as like the buffer, there is an additional, I know that was one of the other parts I brought up, do we need bigger buffers? None of that gets really tweaked or talked about in that subdivision planning process on larger developments, right?
If we added a buffer, or what we're calling landscape yard in zoning now, as a requirement, it would be considered at the edge of the property in the layout of the lots.
Right.
And streets.
Okay. I just didn't know if that was always a part of the current process in the subdivision, or like they do for multifamily larger, where you have the buffers and everything. I just want a clarification on that, if that they just only follow what a neighborhood one treating it as a single lot where you need that side buffer and so on and so forth. I just wanted that clarification if there was additional requirements through the subdivision that might solve some of this problem, or maybe tweaking that in Article 30 would help solve some of that.
Yeah, we would actually probably do that in zoning, but we'd accomplish the same end. So the landscape yards are all in zoning. And so if there were a decision to say with a conservation, that development, if it's next to a traditional neighborhood one development, there should be a landscape yard, a buffer, that would show up in zoning, but would be looked at. The subdivision staff looks at the zoning as someone as well laying out a site.
Okay, thank you.
And I hope I haven't misspoken on behalf of our subdivision staff on here.
All right, thanks, Eric. Hopefully I just started writing down the order of the names, so I apologize if I don't quite have them in order, but I think I've got Rob and then Andrea.
I actually think Roger was right before me.
Okay, go for it, Roger, then.
Sure. So just full disclosure for the group. My company doesn't deal in duplexes, triplexes, anything like that. So take that for, what it's worth. We're not really, don't have a dog in the fight here. My first question, Allison and Laura, is let's go back to 30,000 feet, right? 2040, we've got predicted to have how many people moving to Charlotte? 300 plus thousand more people, right?
Yeah.
I think that's coming out of the 2040 plan.
Yeah, yeah.
Have these changes or proposed changes been kind of fed into the master spreadsheet to make sure that we're still achieving the density in the city to accommodate that growth? Because this is going to be reducing density in a product type, a housing type that, I think was specifically targeted for hitting some of these 2040 goals of inclusion and access. Are those numbers, are we still achieving the 300,000 plus capacity?
So the policy map that outlines kind of the vision for future growth, the basis for how the map is based on growth allocation calculations. And so, I mean, in some ways, like you could get really, really complicated. Oh, sorry, Tony, I didn't realize. You could get really complicated in those growth allocations. And so I'm sure we would go back to our policy map team. Lisa and Kathy are on, and if y'all want to jump in, but as we make changes, and we are considering some other changes, whether it's through policy map, place type transitions, or other things that we're doing. I mean, we do go back ultimately that there is a growth allocation that we're making sure that our future growth in the policy map is achieving. So long-winded answer, yes. I mean, it is, at some point, there's only so much you can calculate from all the nuances of code and market dynamics and all
right.
that.
I totally get it, but that was done
But yeah.
before when we were rolling out the UDO. The consultant went through those calculations and was showing we had so many more units being added in this category, so many more units being added in this category. I think what we're I remember because I think some of the other categories were kind of taking a haircut with the new requirements of the UDO. We were counting on density really from this product type to help the city accommodate the growth. And it seems like we're cutting back on one of the main levers here. But so, I mean, if you guys have those numbers, it'd be great if you shared it with the numbers with the council. But my other observation is,
But
it sounds like
before you move on from that really quick, that's why in my mind, it was really important that when we're proximate to centers, that we increase the allowances for housing options. Like, again, like townhomes are a great product for housing ownership opportunities that don't really exist like we need them. And
totally agree.
so that's why it's not like it's like we need to add more here and maybe remove some here. So it's about maybe reallocating and prioritizing where you turn it up, and then maybe be considerate of where you might want to turn it down.
And totally agree. I mean, if there's multiple levers in that housing matrix, right? So if you're going to dial down here, you've got to turn it up somewhere else. And if you guys are kind of making those calculations, that'd be great. It'd just be great to share with, you know, this group and maybe in your presentation at council, because I know for a fact, you know, the UDO group was counting on, you know, the conversion of single family into these, you know, denser product to accommodate growth, just like every other city out there. You know, if you look at Philadelphia, New York, you know, the growth of that city, it got denser. So you had the brownstones, you had the townhomes. So, you know, that's got to happen. And I think what you're proposing is really going back to the corridor and wedges plan, right? Because we're targeting growth, where before it wasn't targeted. It was like we're laying out, you know, these various place types and form based, and we're just going to let this, you know, let the market, the developers, the single family owners figure out how they're going to fill in that envelope. But we're kind of because it sounds like we're going back to corridors and wedges.
Well, I mean, that's an interesting point. We'll talk about, but I mean, I still do think that what we're trying to prioritize here is the implementation of the 10-minute neighborhood and really being deliberate about the city manager's office and mobility partners are really focusing on those centers and corridors places too. And we're trying to make sure that we're aligning housing in those locations too.
Okay. Yeah, those are my big things. The only other thing I'll throw out there is, in a form-based code, right? The triplex is going to have the same mass as probably an infill single-family house, because whatever was there, the 1960s Crosland Senior Ranch, that went up all over the place. That's going to get scraped, and something bigger is going to go in its place, and it'll basically have the same mass as a duplex or a triplex, depending on the lot size. So it's kind of more about, it seems like it's more about pushing density away from areas. This sounds like, I mean, and within these larger 2+, 3+, acre developments, I guess I'm having a hard time understanding why the mix needs to be in there, because people, if they're new developments within that development, you're buying something that what it's going to be. So it's not like, it's a big surprise that you don't have a single family neighborhood next to you. But I'll leave it there. I don't want to I want other people to talk. So thanks.
Thanks, Roger. Tony, sorry about that, Tony.
Thanks. Quick comment and then a question. Just as having been on the planning commission with John and others and chaired it and then chaired this for 5 years, I just want to, somebody needs to say it, that I appreciate you all in this process, that it's great to keep this going and get this kind of input in an ongoing way. So thank you for that. My next question, and it's more of a sort of a higher level policy question. I've heard a lot of good references to policy goals, sort of the transect, the missing middle, and on. And stepping back, and I guess the question is, from a policy level and what we're trying to accomplish. And really, I'm wearing my NCDOT hat because I see how, as we grow, and most places would love to have the growth that we have. So the challenge is how to deal with it. And I'm thinking about it from a sprawl and gridlock standpoint, but also from an affordability standpoint, because part of what drives sprawl and gridlock is lack of affordability. And your slide, 400 and some thousand for a townhome and over 500,000 for a house with a yard, and choices for people who come here. People are going to make their own choices, and if they, somebody with a good job, really good job, if they want a house with a yard and they can't afford a $550,000 house, so they're going to go live where they can. But if we would like to disincentivize sprawl and give people more choices about, affordability and lifestyle in 10-minute neighborhoods and such, just more from a high level, like discussion of that and how this is framed in that way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, the driving thing goes back to that missing middle slide. I mean, that's really where it's most valuable to introduce opportunities for housing that are more affordable, that don't contribute to sprawl and gridlock, is that having a homogeneous neighborhood of one singular housing type is not the desired outcome. And so really trying to introduce back decades of underbuilding and everything but a single family detached home and an apartment, I think is most important for that. I think the thing that staff is seeing is that, in some ways you could potentially call a large development site on the periphery of the city that's developed very intensely with all triplexes, that's not adjacent to amenities and services and transportation options, contributes to sprawl and gridlock, because you're putting density away from the things that help to prevent sprawl. And so that's kind of the question that, or the thing that we're seeing, is that you're getting that kind of intensity without the complementary services that help support it.
And that's what I'm getting at. And I think that's a very important policy consideration. And candidly, conversely, are you, and I understand that this is going to go on and there may not, but maybe if it's just on the margins, but if people are building triplexes, but they cost $1 million a unit, as I guess it is what it is, but it's just something to consider.
Thanks, Tony. Robert, Andrew, I'm not sure which one of you were next. And then I've got Matt.
I don't know, Andrea, was it you or me? Okay, I'll just go. I don't have a lot to add to what Roger and I agreed with some of what Tony said. I would just say that when back to big picture, when we went down the UDO trail, part of the discussion was, look, we're going to impose some new regulations, where there's going to be a new regulatory framework, and in exchange for that, there's going to be some density trade-offs. And then ultimately, when we get to the other side of this thing, once it's been in place for a couple of years, we hope to have a more streamlined process where everybody has certainty. And obviously we're not there yet, because it's only been in place for less than a year now. But these types of, and first of all, let me just say, Allison, thank you for the presentation. I thought that was real helpful in terms of setting the stage. But I think every time we look at now, we still have the regulatory framework, and that's not changing. In fact, in some cases, that may be getting more difficult. And in addition to that, now we're looking at diminishing some density in certain areas. And I think that is a pretty rough equation to accomplish the things that we say we're trying to accomplish. I understand Tony made the comment about $1 million triplexes, and I get that. And that's probably the discussion for next week. That's the infill stuff, really. I think what we're talking about now is really more the stuff that is potentially in the affordable or range, close to affordable. And it tends to be more on the outskirts, but that's because the land is cheaper. So I guess we have to ask a question. Do we want to create the units knowing that they're going to be in the affordable range, knowing that there's a little bit of a trade-off in terms of transportation, but knowing that we're going to get those units built so that we can house those people? Just a reminder, CMS average salary is, I think, about $54,000 right now. That affords you about $180,000 mortgage. I don't see a whole lot of $180,000 single family homes being sold. Frankly, in Mecklenburg County, I don't see a whole lot of single family $300,000 houses going at this point. So having these options, and frankly, even getting more creative with density going forward. Maybe in some circumstances we create smaller lots. Maybe I think folks are just going to have a change in their mindset. A lot of this was brought on by folks that don't like change, and it's two different kinds of folks. It's in-town neighborhoods that are uncomfortable with some of the changes that are going to be made in terms of higher density, and then folks on the periphery that are, again, in established neighborhoods, but also are concerned about some of those changes. I think going forward as a society, knowing that people are going to be moving here, and that steady stream is going to continue as long as we have positive economic situations here in the region, we're just going to have to get creative about how to do that. And I think the UDO is the first step in doing that. But I think going backwards on some of those density issues is a concern. So I just wanted to lay that. I don't know that I really have a question other than I really would like to see the economic analysis that was done for the first draft and the second draft of the UDO contained a lot of that information about what kind of units we expected to be built as a result. And I think that's what Roger was alluding to. Knowing that data, where that might change depending on what kind of changes might be contemplated would be helpful to have so that we can share that with the folks that are making those decisions. So thank you.
Yeah, and I'll go back and look at that EPS did, but I think really when that analysis was being done, it was really on the infill side of development. It wasn't taking large tracts of land and putting triplexes and duplexes. I just don't think that I mean, really the original spirit was to create density within existing neighborhoods that was compatible with what's there. And I think the larger scale, large developments on the periphery is something that I'm not sure was really expected by many. But thanks, Rob. Andrea.
Well, thank you. So I did listen into the Transportation Planning and Development meeting, and I want to say thank you for expanding on that presentation and giving us some specifics here to consider that really help bring a lot more context in how the advisory committee should be thinking this through. Just for the rest of the folks, my perspective is coming from the ETJ largely and the Steel Creek area. And I guess I'm interested to hear the different perspectives about being scared of growth, wanting to prevent increases in density, possibly not wanting to see mixes of housing types, diversity in affordability and types, and that's not the case at all. I think the perspective from the community here is that the new overlay of the N1 and everything that it encompasses has now given a by rights max out in density, and the locations and the actual capacity here we don't feel has been fully considered. So there's now this by rights maximum density that doesn't necessarily suit the other factors. And that includes being a 10-minute neighborhood. A lot of the areas here that are close to neighborhood center place types are not fully walkable or have public transportation access opportunities yet. It may in the future, but they don't now. A number of the infill parcels, and I want to thank you for lowering that down to 2 acres to consider those as well as 5 acres or more. A lot of those infill parcels are only accessible by private roads. They are not DOT roads, and DOT has said that they are in no position to deed acquire them anytime into the future. So we're looking at what is currently currently lower density areas that don't have the access, don't have the transportation infrastructure available, don't have the school capacity, and also the environmental sensitivity in the Lake Wylie watershed area is a factor. There's a significant amount of development runoff that I know Stormwater's been studying actively. And a number of the proposals that have come in for, which would have been considered rezonings, but now they're not, they're by rights, are putting in a density in areas that are currently septic system. And when they're properly maintained, they're very environmentally sensitive, but now it's all moving to BMP infrastructure, including burying the water in underground tanks to allow for the maximum density on top. So I guess the concern out here is not so much a mix of housing types coming in, but it's the appropriateness of the location and the neighborhood character. So if I can just wrap up and ask a question, is who defines neighborhood character? And is it really appropriate to be looking at a 4-story multifamily housing type immediately abutting a 1 or 2-story single family subdivision with very little room for buffer or tree save because of the site constraints, the environmental constraints, and the by rights, basically greed factor of maxing out the land use there when perhaps it's not really appropriate. So who defines neighborhood character, and how can we model or look at the impact of what you're proposing as offering flexibility, but being realistic about what the capacity is?
I mean, I wish that we could have a shared interpretation of neighborhood character, but I don't think that we would ever get there. So I mean,
and that evolves. I mean, neighborhood character evolves. That's a fact.
Yeah, I mean, even on this call, I don't think we'd ever get there. And so that's really like we're trying. I mean, that's the balance here is that you've got, you know, a comprehensive plan goal of neighborhood diversity and inclusion, and then retaining character and charm. And so, and it's a balance trying to find ways in which we're accomplishing both of those goals, which is why this is a hard conversation. And so, you know, that's kind of why it's taken us a little time to come back to the group from when council charged us to consider this, is because we weren't going to make rash decisions, because I mean, this is important and there are goals that we're wanting to implement. But at the same time, as we start to see stuff come in, you know, we're asking some of the similar questions that you're raising forward, and I appreciate you doing that. That sometimes, you know, we question whether or not that the appropriateness of that type of intensity relative to what's there to support it may make it such that that's not the priority area for where we want to grow versus other places.
So yeah, I appreciate that, Allison. It really separates out what is a subjective decision, which isn't really defensible under ordinance, versus creating or understanding what the actual capacity is, and having some measurable factors that can be agreed upon and grown from there appropriately and included in the policy mapping. So I guess I'm asking how would your group, how would your team look into that through this revision process and the alignment rezoning process. How will you consider the locational factors and the capacity factors instead of just the blanket N1 overlay that is now thrown an incredibly intense land use density in an area that can't support it?
I mean, I think that's really the crux of why we're here in front of this group. I mean, I think, you know, there's certain vision that's articulated within the policy map as where, let's say, N1 and N2 is located, but there's lots of flavors, you know, of N1 type of development. And so a lot of those things can't be solved just by the policy map or the comprehensive plan. It starts to get into the details of development, which is really, you know, live in an ordinance. And it's a very impactful thing in terms of implementing a vision, which is why we're all sitting here talking about this, is that I think we're all in agreement as to what we're trying to accomplish, but how and when and where gets a little complicated. So, but I think the conversation here, I think, is really trying to refine what the vision is for development of our neighborhood 1 zoning districts.
And how do we, is it just now assumed that this going forward is all by rights? I mean, you can't, now that it's an N1, you can't take that away. So I can offer the example that actually your staff had shared in one of the presentations, and that's a proposal going in on Youngblood, sort of south of Tryon. And that one is where previously an R3 single family 10-acre parcels exist, and they're being consolidated. And right now I believe that they've got 30 out of the 40 acres that they're trying for. And so you've gone from what probably a 3 units per acre could have been supported, both in terms of the topography and possibly the access, although the access is only through private roads. But now the proposal that's going in, I think, is around 200 to 200 plus multifamily units. And it's unclear how that can be supported and how it meets the policy goals in terms of 10-minute neighborhood and the other factors. But by rights, it's allowed to go in.
And that's in the ETJ, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So I mean, that's kind of what I mean, that's an example here for kind of the conversation, is that you've got this parcel and you've got, you know, it's in the ETJ, and there's challenges with private roads and who's going to maintain them and access to other services. And maybe that's where things should be more limited, versus take that same acreage and put it next to a regional activity center. And then I think it's highly appropriate.
Correct. Agreed. And I think, you know, our community agrees with that. So yeah, I guess maybe the challenge again is looking at some of the design elements, and, you know, again, how to increase the open space and the buffers and make something, and if that means diminishing the density a bit in order to achieve something that fits neighborhood character, and where the community infrastructure can support that, has the capacities to support it. That seems like it would satisfy the diversity. It would satisfy for the opportunity for more affordable housing, if possible, but still maintain that character and meet the other policy goals. So I guess when you look at building roads, you don't build them to maximum capacity. But that's what we're doing now under the current UDO, is we're just going straight for the maximum capacity and assuming that's going to fix the housing crisis. But it's bringing up a lot of other challenges. So perhaps I like where you're moving in terms of flexibility, in terms of buffers and other design elements, so that the location and capacity are more appropriate to the proposals, or vice versa. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrea. I appreciate that. Matt, sorry you had your hand up a while. We've had, but I appreciate the discussion so far from everyone. So thank you very much. Matt.
Thanks, Allison. Eric had an interesting comment in the chat. He asked, put a slide of the housing units by type, show that to City Council, less duplexes and quads were built in 23 versus pre-UDO. I'm curious, could you pull that slide back up? I'm curious how those are exactly measured, you know, because like is a two-family dwelling measured as a duplex, or is a two-family dwelling building permitted as two townhomes under the how, you know, I just want to make sure that the metrics, the measurement tool is capturing that, you know what I mean? Like the duplex quadplex line right there, how are those measured differently from single family attached / townhome? Is there a box that gets checked in building permitting that
Yeah,
notes them
and
separately?
it is a little complicated. We've been working with our partners over at the county about making sure we're coding things correctly in both of our systems to ensure that the numbers are correct. But we've gone through, and so I'd like to be able to articulate that a little bit, to be able to separate out some of those. The other thing and now this is actually on the last slide that's made this more complex, particularly on the infill side, is that over the summer, a House bill was passed that, and Laura, please correct me if I say it wrong, but to put trides and quads in the residential building code. They were commercial, now they will be residential. And so there's changes too, even within the building code and how things are categorized, and that hasn't been updated in the state building code, which hasn't been updated in the county system yet also, which makes it actually less expensive to build them, but it also removes them from the design aesthetics law, which means it further limits our ability to regulate design of those. So
Right.
anyway,
Well, I would just make sure.
Question, but yeah,
I would make sure in the coin sorting machine
right.
that the county uses, they all end up in the right slots so that we've got an accurate measurement.
Yeah, we can go back. Planning Commission asked that question on Monday too. So I'm going to shoot an email now to kind of get our consultants, anyways, to make sure have these definitions. Like while we're on this slide, I did just want to make a quick point that in the initial stuff when we were pulling this, in that duplex, triplex, quad, like although 2023 numbers look lower, you have to understand a couple things. One is how long it takes projects to get through permitting and the time of implementation. So we're really going to have more data the more time passes, obviously. And then two, that some of those higher numbers are one large project, because those numbers are so small already, can really skew that. So when we were pulling the numbers, there were a couple of big projects that came through where you might have 150 duplexes in one development. And so if all those come online in the same year, like that is going to majorly skew that number. So anyways, just a couple point of clarifications on that specific line.
Yeah, I guess, like I said, you know, as we're looking at this stuff, I think making sure that they're getting measured properly is important. So, you know, at our firm, we're involved with a lot of projects that are similar to this, and it's important you know, the conversations that we have with staff about the things that they like that they're getting, the things that they don't like that they're getting, the things that they didn't expect to get, and the things that they expected to get that they're not getting is all important and part of, you know, how we look at these things. I think, you know, it's fascinating going back to earlier conversations where it was almost like proudly presented that the UDO is not looking at density, but now we're looking at density.
I know.
You know, I feel like it's really misguided because, for example, if you take a building that's 48 feet wide, it can have 3 16-foot wide, you know, triplex units in it, or it can have two 24-foot wide duplex units in it. And they're dramatically different in a cost and a density. You know, the density is 50% more. And so I think I would just be careful what you're doing, because, you know, you're flabbergasted by $1 million townhomes. Just wait until you start limiting what can be done where. You know, Rob already spoke to land cost. I think the land all around the centers and corridors is already cost prohibitive. I was curious, Allison, you know, what you would consider dense if around like Cotswold or somewhere. You know, what would be a appropriate density around the, you know, a center that's marked blue on the map?
I mean, that's kind of why we have a consultant looking at that. I mean, to be frank, we were really reluctant about proposing anything about density, and we really just talked and talked and talked about that. And unfortunately, it's a tool that people understand. And the thing is, like, you know, a couple of you have mentioned scale, in terms of, you know, some of the structures may be similar in scale, but they also, you know, of a single family structure, and then you make that a 3-family structure. Well, I think it's a better utilization of space, but it also comes with, you know, 3 water taps, and it comes with 3 families, and the cars that they have, whether we like cars or not, are 3 driveways, or the need for 3 driveways. I mean, so there are things that come with that, you know, or 3 services that solid waste has to come pick up. There are implications of in terms of infrastructure that comes with that. And so it's not just about scale, it's about the other pieces of it too.
Oh, I totally agree. I mean, you know, but it's kind of like what you're looking at is, you know, $1 million house or $500,000 duplex units, or, you know, $330,000 triplex units. And so you've got a whole affordability quandary that you're dealing with. And I agree with you, you know, as well about the infrastructure being something that I think the city ought to be looking hard at. One of the questions that also popped into my head, you know, Cats has been sort of under fire for quite a while now. You know, where are the next centers going to be identified, you know, in the policy maps that aren't there now? Are we targeting new areas for creating transit hubs that are not existent now? Are we going to be creating new centers where people can say, okay, this is where planning is promoting density, you know, because all that I've heard so far is we want density where we already have density. And, you know, those are often the most entrenched, established neighborhoods that get the most freaked out when people talk about tearing things down and building more density. You know, so, I mean, these are just some things to think about.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's still a great deal of investment needed in some of the centers and corridors that we have right now. And so I think that's really where the manager and our mobility partners are focusing. And I think then over time, you know, through updates to the comp plan and the policy map, I mean, you may see some of those start to occur. I know we're running out of time. I see 2 hands, Eric and Roger.
Sure, I'll be quick. I just want to make a point that the numbers, not to beat those to death, but I think showing those show that triplexes, duplexes, and the large numbers that you mentioned, you give the caveat that, you know, they might not be perfectly accurate, but we were building hundreds of triplexes and duplexes. And the example you showed at the meeting, those were all done under the old zoning code. And I think they think they're only now happening because of the UDO. And I think just getting that, at least for the public to know, whether city council knows or not, I think that narrative is that has only been happening since the UDO. So just making that clear. And then as far as the last discussion you just had, one thing you're right about, you know, you're adding more folks into these areas and the infrastructure and services, but you got to take into account efficiencies. So spreading 3 people out in 3 single family houses versus in one, you know, yes, you make sure the infrastructure handles it, but there's a factor of efficiency too that will be a benefit, that you're not overall, the sprawl is going to eat up more resources when it's spread all over the place compared to getting people to live more efficiently. That's it. That's all I have.
Thanks, Eric. Roger.
Yeah, I'll be real quick too. I know we're out of time. Just general comment, and maybe John or any of the other designers weigh in on this. Yeah, if we start going down the road of trying to design character or anything like that, it inevitably, the more design regulations you put in, the less of a rich design outcome you have. You can't regulate out bad design. It's just going to happen. John's laughing. They don't, when they give out architectural licenses, they don't really have a design, threshold that you have to pass. The more serious thing is, I worry about how this is going to be perceived and maybe the knock-on effects sociologically, right? If we start protecting these neighborhoods from density, you kind of start creating, and I'm just thinking out loud, are you creating a have and have not, right? Well, I've already got my house, I've already got my neighborhood, don't mess with me. For everybody else that wants something, you got to be pushed to these much denser areas. I'm just wondering how that's going to be perceived, and is it reinforcing or going against one of the goals of kind of this more integrated city?
Thanks, Roger. Well, I know we're out of time. What I want to say is that we've got a survey. There's a number of you that are on the call that didn't hear from, and I know you may be traveling or en route or just trying to process everything, and want to make sure that you have an opportunity to weigh in, or if you have additional thoughts and you did weigh in today, that's great too. But we're going to send a survey out just so you can actually put some words to it for staff to consider, and then we'll compile everything and we'll share it out with the whole group so you can see what everybody says. So you'll get something, an email from someone on the planning team later today. So thank you again for your time. I know this is meaty and complicated and challenging and important stuff. So I appreciate you listening and considering some each other's thoughts, and we'll have another fun discussion next week. So thank you again, and we'll same time next Thursday. Yeah.